Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're mapping out a highly controversial and frankly fascinating geopolitical theory presented by Professor Zhang. He actually argues that World War III, well, it's already begun. Now, whether you agree with his perspective or absolutely entirely disagree, his framework offers a really complex lens to view all the current global conflicts going on right now. We'll be impartially breaking down his claims, visualizing exactly how he sees the grand strategies of the world's major powers colliding in real time. Okay, let's dive into this. The entire foundation of Professor Zhang's theory rests on one mind-boggling number, $40 trillion. That is the current national debt of the United States. Zhang asserts that to manage this monumental debt and to save the petrodollar, which is the system where global oil is traded exclusively in U.S. currency, the U.S. is actively utilizing multiple global war fronts. The ultimate goal here? To force the rest of the world to buy American energy and, crucially, to buy American weapons to help pay down that staggering deficit. To understand how he arrives at this conclusion, here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll cover the $40 trillion strategy, America's defense blueprint, the global chessboard, 3 major war fronts, and finally, predicting the final collapse. Let's jump right into Part 1, the $40 trillion strategy and financing an empire. So, Jiang believes the American empire depends entirely on the US dollar remaining the uncontested global reserve currency. Basically, if the dollar falls, the empire falls. So what threatens that dominance? Well, Jiang points to a developing alliance between Russia, China, and Iran. These 3 nations span the entire Asian continent, and they're working to build a massive Eurasian railway system. By connecting their economies and choosing to trade in gold rather than the US dollar, they're effectively bypassing American sea power and financial control altogether. According to Jiang, it's this exact existential threat to the dollar that forced the United States to instigate conflict just to maintain its global dominance. Professor Zhang makes a really bold statement here. He says, quote, "Once this war starts, it can only lead to World War III. From his perspective, the U.S. intentionally escalated conflicts in the Middle East to deliberately cut off China and Europe from their primary energy sources. By destabilizing the Middle East, the rest of the world is suddenly forced to depend on the United States and its Western Hemisphere reserves, like those in Venezuela, for their energy needs. It's a highly calculated move, he argues, to save the American empire." Moving on to Part 2, America's defense blueprint, a 4-point strategy. And this brilliantly illustrates his next point. You see, Zhang doesn't just base this theory on speculation. He actually points directly to the official U.S. national defense strategy as a literal blueprint for the global conflict unfolding right now. He breaks it down into 4 steps. First, secure the Western Hemisphere, essentially claiming a monopoly on all resources from Canada all the way down to South America. Second, force allies like NATO and Japan to step up and pay for their own defense. Third, strangle China economically by blocking major maritime choke points, like the Strait of Malacca. And fourth, supercharge defense manufacturing. Zhang details how the Pentagon actually went to companies like Ford and General Motors and asked them to pivot from making cars to producing highly profitable munitions. The ultimate goal? Mass-produce weapons for divided theaters around the world to absorb and pay down that $40 trillion debt. But here's where Zhang argues the U.S. miscalculated, specifically in the Middle East. He contrasts the 2003 invasion of Iraq with the current tensions with Iran. Iraq's flat desert topography allowed for a really swift shock and awe decapitation strike from the air. It was over quickly. Iran, however, it's a literal mountain fortress. Its topography completely neutralizes air supremacy because their underground missile bases are hidden deep within massive mountain ranges. So a quick victory is virtually impossible. Because of this rugged geography, Iran is fighting what's called a war of attrition. Zhang describes this as a giant game of uncle, where opponents create maximum pain points to force the other side to submit, rather than trying to achieve total destruction. Iran is doing this right now by threatening to block the Strait of Hormuz. By threatening this massive maritime choke point, Iran puts the highly vulnerable desalination plants and food imports of the Gulf Cooperative Council at severe risk. They're effectively holding global energy and local survival hostage. Furthermore, Iran employs what Zhang calls the mosaic strategy. To survive U.S. surveillance and those decapitation strikes we talked about, Iran has completely decentralized its military into 31 distinct, localized armies. Combined with the deep religious seal of the IRGC, this highly localized command structure ensures that Iran will fight indefinitely, aiming to entirely displace U.S. influence from the Muslim world. Essentially, there is no single head of the snake for the U.S. to cut off. All right, Part 3, the global chessboard, players and attack vectors. Zhang uses a chess metaphor to really break down this massive conflict. Every major nation acts according to a grand strategy. Think of this as their queen on the chessboard. The United States seeks Fortress America while trying to divide and rule the rest of the globe, specifically to sell arms. Russia, an autocracy, is pursuing the Third Rome strategy to unite Christian Eurasia. Israel aims for a greater Israel, stretching all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates. And Iran's theocracy is laser-focused on uniting the Muslim world under its leadership. As you can guess, these grand strategies are fundamentally incompatible. Now let's look at the weapons or the attack vectors they use to achieve these goals. The United States heavily relies on its tech supremacy, the sheer financial power of the dollar, and global media. Russia utilizes its vast, unconquerable geography, the unifying force of Orthodox religion, and just massive amounts of artillery. Israel leverages the Mossad, the Jewish diaspora, and Christian Zionists. Meanwhile, Iran utilizes regional proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, alongside cheap, highly effective asymmetrical drone warfare. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these vectors clash out on the open ocean. Professor Zhang points to an incredible phenomenon, the shadow fleet. This is a stateless Russian naval force made up of roughly 1,000 sanctioned oil tankers. Russia uses this massive fleet to evade Western blockades and keep exporting their energy. But Zhang claims the U.S. military is actively seizing these stateless tankers right in the Caribbean to monopolize global energy supplies. He views this direct interference with global energy shipments as a literal act of war happening as we speak. That brings us to part 4. 3 major war fronts, the collision of strategies. This is where the grand strategies physically collide, creating real, localized chaos. Zhang outlines some specific flashpoints. Over in Europe, you have NATO and Russia clashing. A key detail to watch here is Odessa. Zhang notes that if Russia takes Odessa on the Black Sea, they would control 1/3 of the world's carbohydrates. That's essentially controlling the global food supply. In East Asia, we see rising tension over Taiwan and the Strait of Malacca. In the Middle East, Iran faces off against the US and Israel. And crucially, he points out that North Korea is using this exact moment of global distraction to actively extort a wealthy South Korea with constant artillery threats. Across all these fronts, remember that massive $40 trillion debt? Well, the US is perfectly positioned to sell those munitions we discussed earlier to its allies, fueling the conflict, feeding the defense industry, and actively paying down its debt. And finally, part 5, predicting the final collapse, Zhang's unsettling forecast. Based on this incredible financial strain on the global system, Professor Zhang offers several very strict and honestly unsettling predictions for the near future. First, he theorizes that Donald Trump will secure a 3rd term, either through constitutional loopholes or emergency war powers. He predicts the U.S. will institute a massive national draft for males aged 18 to 24 to sustain these forever wars across the globe. He also foresees a rapid shift to an AI civilian state, where digital IDs monitor all your transactions to control public behavior. He predicts Israel will fully realize the Greater Israel Project once the U.S. eventually retreats from the Middle East. And surprisingly, he predicts the U.S. and China won't actually go to war, but will instead reach an economic grand bargain to benefit each other financially amidst all the chaos. Ultimately, Zhang believes the American empire will collapse within the next 5 to 10 years. He parallels this to the Bronze Age collapse from over 3,000 years ago. Just as ancient empires fell to a perfect storm of debt, resource shortages, and massive refugee migrations, Zhang warns that a lack of global fertilizer due to these ongoing wars will lead to sweeping famine, causing millions of starving refugees to move across the globe and completely overwhelm modern infrastructure. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to explain why the general public doesn't see this coming, Zhang actually applies Plato's allegory of the cave. He argues that a hidden structure projects a fake reality, like shadows on a cave wall, to the masses. It starts with the military-industrial complex enforcing the rules, followed by financial elites and bankers setting the global economy. They then use multilateral organizations to give it all a facade of fairness. And finally, they rely on the media and education systems to enforce this illusion on the public, making us accept the system as entirely natural. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy final question. If the empire falls, how do we rebuild our communities? Professor Zhang's ultimate philosophical takeaway is that survival in the face of cyclical imperial collapse doesn't rely on governments or politicians. It relies entirely on neighborhood resilience, coming together with those physically around you and holding on to a decentralized sense of hope. It is a dense, controversial framework for